Thank you very much, Kitty, and what a pleasure to be here today. I note that I'm the only American that you have to listen to in the course of this event. Let me just say that we Americans apologize for the temporary malfunctioning of our country and ask you to bear with us while we work hard on the necessary repairs. Perhaps you shouldn't have had any Americans, at least me. Normally, I don't get too nervous when I speak, but today is an exception. In fact, Cardinal Turks and I have been a little intimidated ever since your kind invitation arrived, and I can explain why by showing you one picture. That's the church in my town. At its fullest on Christmas Eve, we can squeeze about 60 people inside. It's true that very occasionally I preach when they can't get a real minister, but I've never risen any higher in the ecclesial hierarchy than Sunday school teacher. So to be surrounded by all the eminences and excellencies and great theologians of the world is more than a little intimidating. If there's any excuse for me to be here, it might be sort of sheer endurance. I wrote the first book for a non-scientific audience about climate change. It came out in 1989, so 30 years ago next year. And at the time, what we called the greenhouse effect was still theoretical, abstract. In the future, now, of course, it is the great fact of daily life on our planet, tearing apart the lives of the poorest and most vulnerable with an endless onslaught of storm and fire and drought and flood. Barely a day passes without some new record somewhere on Earth, the highest temperature, the greatest rainfall. And of course, these disasters follow the iron law of global warming. The less you've done to cause the problem, the more you suffer. Obviously, these crises will intensify as the planet continues to warm, and just as obviously, our political structures are not capable of dealing humanely with the results. Look at the hideous reaction in too many countries to even relatively low levels of migration in the last few years, far, far, far below what we will see as the century wears on and the planet warms. So let me be clear again, Kitty. We are losing. As Professor Schellhuber pointed out yesterday, we are not closing the gap fast enough. We don't need to be losing. As Professor Stern made clear yesterday, we have the technology we need, but we are losing because we are not going fast enough. This is a race, and every wildfire and every flood and every crashing glacier face is a reminder that we are behind. So perhaps we should change some of our ways of acting. That's, in a sense, what I did. For 15 years after the end of nature, I wrote more books about climate change, and I came to more conferences. But I could see that even though we had won the scientific argument, we were losing the political fight. The power of the fossil fuel industry was and is simply too great. This is the essential political fact of this debate. If diplomats were to have any chance, they needed a movement behind them. And perhaps, though I am a writer, I was feeling as if words weren't enough. As the Pope said to a group of Italian youth last year, if I say I am a Christian and I go to Mass every Sunday with my parents, but I don't help my grandparents, don't help the poor, don't visit the sick, then it is not witness and it is useless. It is nothing other than being a parrot Christian. Words, words, words. I was tired of words, or at least I thought they needed actions to match them. And so we began to organize, to try and build the mass movement for climate action that really hadn't existed. We founded 350.org a decade ago, taking its odd name from what the scientists told us was the most carbon we could safely have in the atmosphere, 350 parts per million. It's since grown into the largest grassroots global climate campaign, though by now it is just one part of a vast movement that attempts to provide some kind of counterweight to the fossil fuel industry, to the powers and principalities of this moment. We've worked in three basic ways. One is essentially educational. We've organized at least 20,000 mass demonstrations and protests around the world in every country except North Korea. They are designed to draw attention to the need for climate action. This is a picture of one of the largest, 400,000 people in the streets of New York in the run-up to the Paris Climate Conference, when Pope Francis this morning asked the public to put more pressure on our authorities ahead of this year's climate summit in California. He was speaking our language. If you happen to be on the West Coast in the fall, we will see you in the streets of San Francisco on September 8th. This work of education, as is usually the case, taught us a good deal too. 350.org was founded mostly by young people. I'm obviously old, but my 7 original collaborators were all college undergraduates, and young people continue to do most of the work. And we quickly learned that the other stereotypes about environmentalists were wrong as well, particularly the idea that environmentalism was something that rich white people did. We quickly learned that our collaborators around the world were mostly poor, black, brown, Asian, young, because that's what the world mostly consists of. These frontline communities lead this fight now everywhere. Our second line of work involves trying to slow the expansion of the fossil fuel industry. In a world where ice caps are already melting, it clearly makes no sense to build yet more oil pipelines or coal mines or gas terminals. As Professor Stern said yesterday, they will last for decades and lock us into a future of relentless heat. This is what the Pope meant when he discussed the need to keep fossil fuels in the ground in his recent letter to oil executives. There's simply no other way to make the climate math work. So we've joined those who use nonviolence in all its forms to try and stop these projects. Nonviolence is perhaps the greatest invention of the 20th century, though obviously it draws much of its inspiration from the Sermon on the Mount. And it's used by contemporary Christians, among others, with great effect. Sunday, for instance, marks the year anniversary of the day that the Sisters of the Adorers of the Blood of Christ erected a chapel in Pennsylvania in the path of a proposed pipeline. If they're going to build the pipeline, they're going to have to tear down the chapel. That's the kind of action that we like to see. Or alternately, here's a picture of many, many young people who have tied their wrists, you can just see their wrists, to the fence around the White House as one part of an enormous effort, so far successful, to stop the Keystone Pipeline out of the tar sands of Canada through the United States. The greatest practitioners of this nonviolent strategy at the moment, I think, are indigenous people around the world. As we meet here today, they are leading fights nonviolently to stop pipelines in Minnesota, in British Columbia, to stop vast new coal mines in Australia, to demand attention to the rising seas and dying corals of the Pacific. We'll get to hear from the Pacific climate warriors later today. They are some of the great activists on planet Earth. That the oldest wisdom traditions of the planet are now joined with the newest scientific wisdom traditions should give us all hope. And that a great many people, acting out of their faith traditions, are willing to go to jail should give us all hope as well. I didn't expect to be going to jail myself in my life, but I've learned that it is not the end of the world. The end of the world is the end of the world, and that's why we do what we need to do. Our third line of work has been to try and cut off the financial resources that the fossil fuel industry depends on. I'm going to try and start, I think it seems to be going, a little slideshow going here that will play as I talk. It's simply a list of all the institutions around the world that have divested their fossil fuel stocks, sold their stocks in coal and oil and gas companies. They now number in the thousands. Their portfolios are worth more than $7 trillion. This is the most successful campaign of its kind in history, outstripping even the anti-apartheid effort of a generation ago that it was modeled on. Let me explain the basis of this campaign. It comes first from the belated recognition that the fossil fuel industry has far more carbon in its reserves than we can ever afford to burn. As the group Carbon Tracker pointed out in a small report in 2012, the world's 200 biggest coal, oil, and gas companies have told their banks and shareholders that they plan to dig up and burn roughly 5 times the carbon needed to take us past the 2-degree red line drawn by international negotiators. That is, if these companies carry out their business plans, there is no mystery to how this drama ends. It ends with the destruction of countless species and countless humans. And yet, these companies not only continue to drain those reserves, they actively search for new deposits of coal and oil and gas. This is folly on an inconceivable scale. We've also learned over the last few years, thanks to remarkable investigations by journalistic workers in the countries where these companies are headquartered, that these firms knew everything there was to know about climate change 30 and 40 years ago. Exxon, for instance, had senior scientists telling their executives how much and how fast it would warm in the early 1980s. Those executives believed those scientists. They began to lay plans to drill in what they knew would be a thawing Arctic. They began building their drilling rigs to compensate for the rise in sea level they knew was coming. But they didn't tell the rest of us. Instead, they began to spend vast sums to build the architecture of deceit and denial and disinformation that has kept us locked for a generation in a pointless debate about whether climate change was real. A debate that both sides knew the answer to when it began. It's just that one of them was willing to lie. And given the stakes, that's among the most consequential lies in human history. When Pope Francis spoke this morning about the ways that the powerful manipulate information, he was utterly correct. I am reminded, when I think of the oil companies and their investors, of what to me is one of the hardest stories in the gospel, when the rich young ruler comes to ask Jesus what he must do to be good. Jesus tells him, he says, sell what you have and give it to the poor. And Matthew and Mark then tell us that the young man went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. He wanted to be good, but goodness came at too high a price, and so he went away sorrowful and sad. In this case, the oil companies weren't even asked to impoverish themselves, merely to switch to making their money from the solar panels and wind turbines that engineers have made affordable and effective. But so far, they've gone away sorrowful, paying lip service to the dangers of climate change, but proving unwilling to make any meaningful shift in their practices. And so divestment is one way that we pressure them. And there have been wonderful moments in this fight. Early on, the heirs to the Rockefeller fortune, the first oil fortune, announced that they were divesting their charities on the grounds that it was simply immoral to continue raising the temperature of the planet, and on the grounds that the economic future lay with renewable energy. This was an act of conscience that galvanized many. Young people have waged this fight at a great many universities. Almost half the colleges in the UK, for instance, have now divested. Great cities, New York, London, Paris, have taken this step with their pension funds. New academic research published within the year shows that divestment has been remarkably effective at focusing attention on global warming and on reducing the resources that these companies have for new exploration. Faith communities have been at the forefront. The World Council of Churches, entire denominations have divested. The Episcopalians, the Lutherans, the United Church of Christ, the Unitarians, the Islamic Society of North America. And of course, Catholic institutions have played a crucial role with more than 100 institutions, including Caritas International, that have now divested from fossil fuel. I remember very early on in this campaign when the University of Dayton, a Marianist institution, became one of the first colleges in America, and it divested its $600 million investment portfolio, saying simply that it couldn't square that investment in fossil fuel with the prophetic words of Pope Francis. If it's wrong to wreck the planet, they said, it is wrong to try and profit from that wreckage. And I confess that I had tears in my eyes last year when word came that the Diocese of Assisi had divested, because that original Francis has been to me as much an inspiration as his namesake that we met this morning. We are very hopeful that the Vatican Bank itself will soon join this particular campaign. No single action would send a stronger message that the words of Pope Francis had sunk in. No single action would do more to galvanize the planet. We understand, sadly, that we can no longer stop global warming, only try to slow it and limit it sufficiently to keep civilizations afloat, and with them many billions of people and some of the rest of God's creation. But even that task requires that we move with great speed and with great conviction. Laudato Si is the landmark intellectual work of our new millennia. It's now up to all of us to make its words real. Thank you.